In this class, we're going to delve more deeply into the religious schisms, mostly within Christendom, in Europe, that were major sources of conflict and political divides, intrigues, and wars that ravaged Europe for many, many centuries. Here we're considering the interplay of culture, of ideas, of reform, of politics, and of war. It's a very, very rich brew. This is a story which is at least 1,000 years old, and a story that's important to understand to really understand the dynamics of modern history. Well, going back 1,000 years, indeed, more specifically to the year 1054, one of the first and still lasting and important divides in European Christendom occurred with the Great Schism of the Church between the East and the West, specifically between Rome and Constantinople. Now, that schism has its roots in the divide of the Roman Empire itself, which centuries before had already divided the leadership of the Roman Empire to emperors in the West with capital in Rome and emperors in the East with the capital in Constantinople. And it's not surprising given the large distances, the differences of language, Latin in the West, Greek in the East, the differences of tradition and of ethnicity, that there would be a growing apart. But the growing apart was not only in politics, which became decisive with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, but also within Christianity itself. And that divide really was over two kinds of issues. One, religious doctrine, and second, who's in charge? Is the Pope of Rome the leader of the church, or is the church led collegially by bishops in different key areas? Is the Bishop of Constantinople to fall under the authority of Rome, or is the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople in effect equals within the church? That's the politics. So doctrine and politics led to a growing divide, and in 1054, Christendom divided. And that divide was between the Roman Catholic Church to the west and the Orthodox Christian churches to the east. This is obviously a divide that continues to be of enormous relevance today. We have Orthodox churches throughout Eastern Europe and Russia. We have the Roman Catholic Church predominantly in the western parts of Europe. And countries that are at the divide themselves between Catholicism and Orthodoxy find even today deep internal cultural divides. And Exhibit A for this is none other than Ukraine, which is a country that has a largely Catholic population in Western Ukraine, and as one moves to the east of Ukraine, much more of an Orthodox Christian population. And so this great schism, this first of the major schisms of Christianity, 1054, is a divide of tremendous relevance until today. But the church was never quiet thereafter, because within the Western church, divisions and calls for reform and opponents of papal rule and authority would not only reappear, but also find tremendous resonance among populations and among political leaders within Western Europe. So we're going to visit several of the sites of these religious divides that led to bitter religious wars. One of the earliest reformers of Western Christianity was John Wycliffe, a professor at Oxford University who called for reforms within the church. And Wycliffe became a major influence for a leading scholar and theologian in Prague. Now remember, Prague in the 14th century was the seat of the Holy Roman Empire. Charles IV of the House of Luxembourg was emperor, and Charles IV established Charles University in Prague in 1348. And one of the great academics at Charles University, one of the great theologians, was Jan Hus. And Hus was a follower of Wycliffe at Oxford. So Hus began to preach and proclaim the need for reform of the church. Well, the papal authorities were not having it, and in 1415, Hus was burned at the stake, by order of the Pope. And this ignited huge divisions within Christendom, and those divisions would spill out into open warfare and continued conflict in the centuries ahead. It seems that almost on a century basis from Wycliffe to Hus, and a century later to another major voice of religious reform and ultimately division. And I'm speaking of Martin Luther, a monk in Wittenberg in today's Germany, calling for fundamental reforms of the church and accusing the Pope of corruption. Luther's 95 Theses posted to the church doors in Wittenberg ignited what would become known as the Protestant Reformation, although one could date that back to Wycliffe or back to Jan Hus. But in 1517 and onward, Europe became embroiled not only in profound theological controversy, but in open religious war. And the religious divides led to political divides. Many of the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire said, we'll go with the new reform movement of Luther, and they became Lutherans, followers of Luther. Henry VIII in Britain said, I don't want papal authority, I want a divorce. And so Henry VIII, of course, instituted, demanded, commanded the establishment of the Church of England, which could grant him his desired divorce. And so the religious reformation and the religious divides and calls for reform were matched by the political divisions within Europe, with political rulers taking sides. Are you on the side of the Pope and Roman Catholicism? Are you on the side of the reformers and those who want to break from the Catholic tradition and especially from papal authority? And this era of Reformation was therefore an era also of major political contestation in Europe, and the most decisive period of that contestation, the most violent, was the 30 Years' War of Europe between 1618 and 1648, a war that had many causes and many dimensions, but one of which was a war between those places that were professing the Catholic faith and those that were professing the new Reformed faiths of Lutheranism. And that war ended up in 1648 in giving rise to a divided Europe and a divided Christendom between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, which of course is with us until today. Well, the impulse of reform would continue in many, many ways, and during the Enlightenment era, especially in the 18th century and the early 19th century, not only were there the first moves towards secularism and a distancing from Christianity itself, but there were also continued tremendous reform movements and new controversies between political authorities and the church. And one of the most notable occurred in Vienna and in the Habsburg lands during the Enlightenment, when Emperor Joseph II, at the end of the 18th century, called for basic enlightened reforms of the churches, including closing many of the monasteries around the Habsburg lands, because he claimed that they were not fulfilling the public functions. And so this history of the great schisms, first the schism between Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and then between Catholicism and various Protestant faiths, is a central part of the cultural, religious, and political history of Europe. Let's go have a look with our own eyes at some of these sites of these pivotal developments. We'll visit Istanbul, then Constantinople, the place where the Great Schism of 1054 first divided the church. We'll visit Prague, home of Jan Hus and the Hussite movement, demanding fundamental reforms of the church 100 years before Martin Luther. We'll visit Vienna, where the Habsburgs were the great defenders of Catholicism, but later on also great reformers in the Enlightenment spirit. We'll visit one of the greatest of the monasteries of the Habsburg lands in Melk, an amazing monastery, and one of those that escaped the edicts of closure of Joseph II, because Melk was fulfilling social purposes, especially the education of the young in that region. And we'll visit Budapest, a place that was part of the Habsburg lands, but also a place that was under Ottoman domination for centuries, so at the borderland between the Christian world and the Ottoman world, under Ottoman domination for 150 years until regaining its independence from Ottoman rule at the very end of the 17th century. These are all iconic sites in the heart of Europe, or in the case of Constantinople and Istanbul, the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, and they tell us a great deal and teach us a great deal about the interplay of religion, ideas, and power. So let's go have a look.